I started to work as a television reporter about 10 years ago for the ITV programme This Week, which was the network's main current affairs show in those days. On the first day I went into the office, I said to the producer rather enthusiastically, "I think we ought to go and cover Rhodesia." And he, to my surprise, said, "Right, off you go." The next day I was in Salisbury. The reason I was there was that you might recall that sometime before that, Ian Smith, on behalf of the white minority there, had declared UDI, a unilateral declaration of independence from Britain, asserting the opposition of the whites to majority rule, the whites being outnumbered in Rhodesia by some 20 to 1. In about 1972, the government of the day, the British government, came up with a proposal for a solution, which was quickly accepted by the whites, not least because it left virtually all power in their hands. But the government was also committed to a test of African opinion, and to that end they sent out a commission to Rhodesia headed by Lord Pearce. That's why I was there, both to watch the commission at work and to feel for myself the mood of the African people. It didn't take long to find out.
Those of you who agree to the proposals being accepted, please put your hands up.
Avo vanobvumirana nezvirongwa izvi kuti zvitambirwe vangasimudza maoko avo here?
Those of you who don't agree, please put your hands up.
Vasingabvumirani nezvirongwa simudzai maoko.
The result was inevitable. The prospect of outright apartheid, which confronts them if the settlement's rejected, plainly doesn't daunt them. For the moment they have the power of veto, and they're in revolt. The message was plain. The Africans were not content to settle for anything less than majority rule, and I returned to London and reported accordingly. To my surprise, much of the media still reported as if the issue was in doubt. I was by now convinced that if the white minority did not accept majority rule, then war was inevitable, and yet much of the media comment seemed to echo the hopes of the Foreign Office that if only everyone in Rhodesia would be reasonable, the mess would be sorted out, which meant in practice that if only the blacks would surrender indefinitely to white supremacy. It confirmed my suspicions that one should always be very cautious of what one reads, hears and sees in the media. As it happened, of course, the settlement was rejected, there was war, and a very bloody war, and then peace and ultimately the transformation of Rhodesia into Zimbabwe. My feeling that the orthodox view of the media frequently distorts what it purports to describe was reinforced in Africa again in another country in the next year. In 1973, Ethiopia was known to the world as a romantic, if rather backward, feudal kingdom. We discovered, by chance, a very different Ethiopia. This is a queue for food. These people are Ethiopian peasants. Once they had cattle, land and houses. They sold them all to buy food. Now they have only their rags. They're destitute. There are perhaps 1,000 people in this queue. In the province of Wollo, where they live, 700,000 people are in the same state. In Ethiopia as a whole, nearly 2 million people are suffering. In Wallo, there are 23 food distribution centres like this, feeding more than 250,000 starving people. Here, they receive 2 meals a day. The food, 2 handfuls of boiled wheat in the morning and a piece of bread in the afternoon, keeps them from death, no more. Last year, these people were strong, fit and active. They'd known hardship, of course. They'd suffered several years of drought. But a year ago, when the rains failed utterly, their crops failed too. This spring, the rains failed again. By April this year, they were starving. They dragged themselves exhausted into the towns, many of them dying on the way. These men, women and children have been like this now, surviving, not living, for 6 months. There has not been enough food. In the last 6 months in Wallo alone, at least 50,000 and possibly more than 100,000 people have died from the famine. The famine in Ethiopia shocked the world. It also played some part in the overthrow of the emperor and his replacement by a Marxist regime more allied to the Soviet Union than to the United States. But the famine drove me to find out why such a disaster could take place, because it was clear that this was not just an act of God. The further you looked, you had to examine the basic social and economic structure of the country, because it was clear that this was at fault. And this was a structure which only survived because of a very tyrannical political regime. And it seemed to me that therefore revolution in Ethiopia was as inevitable as war in Rhodesia. And I became much more interested in the relationship between the people and their rulers. And so in 1976, when a terrible earthquake erupted in the little Central American country of Guatemala, I went there with the clear purpose of exploring beyond the immediate disaster, which had devastated the lives of the poor, but had left the lives of the rich relatively untouched. At 3 o'clock on the morning of February the 4th, there was a rumble. The earth trembled and shook. The people tried to run, but were pressed to the ground by the violence of the earth's convulsion. On the ravines that surround the capital city, the dry soil cracked and thundered down into the gorge below, burying homes and people on its way. Buildings crashed to the ground. Within 30 seconds, 25,000 people had died, 100,000 were wounded, and 1 million had lost their homes. In the slums of Guatemala City, the devastation is total. 5 weeks after the disaster, a swirling grit assaults the eyes and chokes the lungs. In street after street, eerie in the dust fog, the people try with dogged energy to reconstruct their shattered lives. The poor dig for their possessions in the rubble where their homes once stood, in the ravines, on the edge of the city where no man should have to live, but where they were driven because safe flat land cost too much. They rescue every half-ruined possession, leaving behind only those things which have no further use. It is also true that earthquakes don't inevitably destroy what man has made. This slender new bridge spans one of the ravines into which fell the homes of those who lived in the slums, and in which are buried some of their bodies. The bridge was undamaged. Untouched, too, were many houses in other parts of the city, where those who own and run Guatemala live in elegant, expensive luxury. They are untouched by the squalor of the rest of Guatemala, and the earthquake passed them by. Nor did it damage their institutions. The new Ministry of Finance, the Bank of Guatemala, the Department of Justice, the City Hall were all undamaged. Also untouched were the flats and office blocks which belong to the national and multinational companies who between them share the wealth of the nation. 6th Avenue, the commercial center of the city, paused for a moment in shock and then noisily returned to making money. The names which jostle for attention are international. The United States does much business in the capital. 80 of America's largest companies are here. Mining, chemicals, banking, insurance, marketing and transport. America has much to preserve in Guatemala. Appropriately, the American embassy was also undamaged. It was obvious that the poor suffered because they were poor, which prompts the question, why were they poor? Or rather, why was so much of the population so very poor and so little of it so very rich? Once again, the answer seemed to lie in the social and economic structure of the country. When I came back and reported that the tyrants who ruled in Guatemala were propped up by the United States, I was attacked by some people for an unwarranted assault upon a good ally of Britain, which to my mind missed the point, because all I was trying to do was to describe reality as I found it. No reporter can expect to get it exactly right, to have the final word. There's no absolute truth, and there are many ways of seeing. All that you can hope to do is to be reasonably accurate, fair, and to the point. Getting to the point is often very difficult, not least because governments all over the world spend much time trying to divert your attention elsewhere. So when we decided to report from Chile, we thought the only way to do it adequately was to go there in secret. And so two of us, a cameraman armed with a Super 8 tourist camera and myself with a notebook, slipped into Santiago pretending we were on holiday. Our purpose to try and uncover the reality which lay behind the image that the dictators in Chile were hoping to present to the rest of the world. It was an unnerving experience. The military rhetoric drones on insistently about the noble ideals that have led to the rebirth of the motherland under military rule. Before the mountains, the sea and the sky, before the Chile that belongs to all and each of us, the armed forces swear to ensure a heroic future for the nation. So speak the dictators. The military junta is led by General Pinochet. Before the coup, his qualities seemed unremarkable. He was thought, not least by his colleagues, to be obsequious and incompetent. In power, his true talent was soon revealed. The 4 years of his rule have been distinguished by mass detention, mass torture, mass murder, mass poverty, mass hunger, and, not surprisingly, by a mass exodus. 7 years ago, a Marxist was elected president of Chile, the first time ever that democracy had chosen Marxism through the ballot box. Salvador Allende vowed to advance the cause of socialism by the parliamentary path. A prospect which alarmed the right and incensed the government of the United States. The CIA was instructed to foment unrest with the purpose of undermining democracy under Allende. The coup came in September 1973. The destruction of the presidential palace, the death of Allende, ushered in a rule of terror. The regime chose to hack democracy out at the roots. Arrests, detention, torture, and murder. In its first years, the regime murdered 5, 10, perhaps 15,000 people. 4 years on, the presidential palace is still in ruins, a monument to the destruction of politics in Chile. All political parties being banned, Parliament, where a respected democracy had flourished for most of this century, is now deserted. Four years on, Chile is a police state in a state of siege. Martial law, rule by decree. And control by fear. The secret police are everywhere. An unnerving reminder that the state is always watching you. These men are the few public faces of a vast secret force created after the coup with the purpose of eliminating opposition. No law inhibits them. They arrest, detain, interrogate at whim. They have tortured and murdered with impunity. And terror works. Reminds you that politics is outlawed, that to talk freely is forbidden. That you may not meet in groups of more than 8. And under the rule of terror, you wonder always who is watching you, who is listening. And you discuss openly only those matters which will offend no one. And you trust no one. If you oppose in private or risk retribution by the state. The United Nations condemns Chile each year, and each year the UN is ignored. Some risk all. These women are the vanguard of a group known as the Families of the Disappeared. Mariana Guzman's husband was arrested in May last year by the secret police. He disappeared. The parents of Maria Araya were also arrested last year. They too disappeared. Maria Pavlos's husband was arrested last year before Christmas, likewise disappeared. These are the disappeared. The process began after the coup in 1973. First 10, then 20, 30, 100, 200, 500, 1,000, even more. Trade union leaders, social workers, students, those who would practice politics. The regime denies all knowledge and refuses explanation. The United Nations wants to investigate, but is forbidden to enter the country. It is feared that all these men and women are dead. 2 years ago, General Pinochet had a shrine built in honor of freedom in Chile. The flame burns eternally, a searing monument to a monumental lie. Now, there were those who said that for all its faults, Chile was an orderly society advancing slowly towards prosperity for all. And they accused me, therefore, of being biased and unfair. But I find it difficult to understand how anyone who believes in democracy or freedom can be neutral about that kind of situation. The same was true in Nicaragua a year later. Nicaragua is a small Latin American country which suddenly exploded onto the front pages of the world's press. Once again, there was a familiar pattern. An impoverished population, a ruthless dictator, an uprising, and then civil war. On this occasion, the dictator in question, President Somoza, chose to suppress the rebellion by bombing his own people. Guerrilla fighters, the Sandinistas, fire impotently at Somoza's planes. The guerrillas were outnumbered and outgunned, but with the support of the people, they had control of the streets. So Somoza ordered the population be bombarded from the air to clear the way for the army to enter the cities. The war was fought fiercely, one city at a time, street by street. The outcome was inevitable. Free to destroy anything in their path, the tanks were bound to win. Terrified at the scale of the onslaught, the people fled. This city, Esteli, was soon deserted except for the fighters. Before the exodus, though, many hundreds of civilians had already been massacred in the army's onslaught. As the Sandinistas withdrew, they had time to burn only a small number of the corpses which littered the city. Then they melted away, leaving Esteli to frustrated soldiers determined to exact vengeance upon the population. On the surface, nothing's changed. The dictator's trigger-happy troops still race the streets, protecting their president from his people. He remains in his bunker, now isolated and deserted at last by America, anxious if unrepentant. Are you satisfied with the performance of your National Guard in the last month, in the last fighting?
If we consider victory, success, yes.
Do you have no qualms about the means by which that success has been achieved?
I could have done it in a less painful way, but the circumstances made it so that we had to act that way.
How do you mean?
Well, if I would have had 5,000 additional men under arms, we could have taken our time.
You've said, I think I'm right, that the exercise that you were engaged in was to protect the people of Nicaragua. From the outside, bombing seems a rather curious form of protection. Could you explain why you decided to do that?
In the first place, let me say this. To maintain the peace of the country is a way of protecting the people. Neutralizing those who break the peace is also a form of protecting the people. Therefore, we have been forced to utilize certain arms to, shall we say, create the conditions in isolated spots so that our troops could go by. And for that reason, we've had to use on-the-spot rocket fire to get snipers out of the way.
The anguish of Nicaragua is not yet over. The oppression persists, the fear and the anger, the certainty that the dictator must and will be brought down. The young men are in the hills in hiding, waiting to return. No one knows how many there now are, where they are, or when they'll be back. That they will return is beyond any doubt. As it happened, Somoza was overthrown and fled for sanctuary in the United States, while Nicaragua took the first faltering steps towards democracy. Now, until that upheaval, Nicaragua, like Ethiopia and Guatemala, had been virtually ignored by the rest of us. And that's how we came to make a series of programs in South America from countries which were not in the news at all. Television tends to feed on drama, sensation, and disaster. We thought that it would be a good idea to try and get a little closer to reality before it hit the headlines, to look at the roots of the crisis rather than the aftermath of the upheaval. We chose countries which faced the kind of appalling problems that can be seen in many parts of the world. And that's how we ended up in Bolivia, 15,000 feet up in the Andes at Siglo XX, the biggest tin mine in the world. Bolivia depends for its very survival upon these men. Tin is the nation's wealth, which is sold from here to serve the rest of the world. The mine has 500 miles of tunnel, which honeycomb through the mountain in search of tin. This is where tin cans begin. The drills are at work 24 hours a day. Emilio Cerudo has worked here for 13 years. Every day of the week. He hates it.
The life of a miner here is a life of submission. Pushed around this way and that. That's a miner's life. Always suffering. Always fighting. Risking death at any moment. We go in alive and come out dead.
Siglo XX has served Bolivia well. It has earned thousands of millions of dollars from abroad. Almost none of the money has come back to the town. It is taken to finance a nation which is still a pauper.
It is countries far away from here that benefit from our minerals which give them a standard of living much higher than our own. And yes, I believe that they are responsible for the condition of Bolivia today. They consider us no more than a country whose job it is to provide them with raw materials. They control every aspect of our lives.
Bolivia is trapped in a world where prices are measured in pounds and dollars and not in human lives. It's an astonishing thought, isn't it, that people in one part of the world can have so much power over people living in another part. But that's really the point, because once you begin to disentangle the roots of conflict, you begin to discover that exploitation by one group of
of one nation by another contributes greatly, not only to the misery of the world, but also to the threat of war, which endangers all of us.